My name is Rob. I am the Director of Events and Marketing at PowerToFly. Thank you for joining us for our final event of the year. And given the large amount of companies that have announced requiring staff to return to the office 5 days a week in 2025, we wanted to bring us all together to share some of the current trends on this topic and offer some advice, most of all, hear about what you all are experiencing. So let's go. And Isa, if you want to share slide 2. Oh, and we are also, while this year is ending, we are going to be back next year in 2025. Our first invite-only executive forum of the year will be on Friday, January 31st at 1 p.m. and is entitled Reimagining Inclusion, Building Bridges in Changing Environment. We're really going to focus on some of the far-reaching impact that some of the policy shifts that we're seeing in the workplace is going to have on all of us. So join us for some insights there. And if you do want to join us, please just put a +1 into the chat and we will make sure we follow up with you on that. And on this next slide, you can also see that we have a SHRM code for this event as well. So if you are a member of SHRM, this meeting is eligible. I'm putting that code there in the chat also so you can take a look. And on these next few slides, you can just see some of the amazing companies that we have had join us throughout the year. And some of you are hopefully here with us today as well. And I also wanted to let you all know that PowerToFly is now accepting sponsors for our 2025 Summit and Job Fair series. That's kicking off in February with our Amplifying Black Excellence Summit. Summer sponsorships include a featured speaking slot, participation in our job fair, and access to over 6,000 diverse professionals each month. So just reply to your reminder email if you're interested in more information. And really, finally, just as a reminder, PowerToFly is here to be your partner in all things attracting, hiring, and retaining your workforce, and we're happy to follow up on any other information. But let's look at what today's agenda is going to be. So we really are going to be focusing on this idea that workers are in many places going to be returning to a brick and mortar office in 2025, and how do they feel about it? We're going to have a conversation with PowerToFly's own head of growth, Sienna Brown, who's going to offer some tips and action steps that we can take. Then the great part of these events, we're going to move into our breakout rooms where we're going to dive deeper into hearing what you all are doing. We want to hear from you. And remember, this is a group discussion during that part. So only the main stage is being recorded for our archival purposes. We will not be recording those breakout rooms. Okay, let's dive into today's topic. So just on December 6th, Forbes had the headline you can see on your screen, "The Great Office Return. Will 2025 be the end of remote work?" So to quote Forbes writer Rachel Wells, there are so many conflicting ideas regarding remote work, which makes this an ongoing workplace debate. And the news regarding big name companies like Amazon and Dell mandating 5-day-a-week RTO in 2025 leaves many scratching their heads and concerned about where they might end up working in 2025 and beyond. So let's look at what's happening in the world. And speaking of Amazon, much of the conversation around the return to office movement was really sparked when the retail giant announced in September 2024 that employees would need to return to the office 5 days a week. CEO Andy Jassy said, "We've observed that it's easier for our teams to learn, model, practice, and strengthen our culture. Collaborating, brainstorming, and inventing are simpler and more effective. Teaching and learning from one another are more seamless, and teams tend to be more connected to one another when they are in the same place." And Amazon is not alone. There are many other companies that have announced return to office mandates in 2025, including Walmart, Dell, X, JP Morgan, Zoom, and Disney, or have perhaps already returned. In the case of AT&T, they're actually requiring workers to return to the office despite closing 300 office locations since the pandemic, making many fear that they may be forced to relocate or quit. And yet, though, Jassy's reasoning does have a lot of merit, as found in PowerToFly's own What Diverse Talent Wants survey. That survey showed that 73% of respondents wanted more team building and camaraderie. So could in-person work actually help to solve this? So feel free to add your thoughts to the chat, or definitely let us know when we get to our roundtable portion. But now let's dive deeper into the current state of how people are actually working. So this is a very recent report from Flex Index that was just released in Q4 2024. And it shows that structured hybrid work really dominates as the preferred work model for US companies. 43% of US companies now operate under a structured hybrid model. Of course, that wasn't the case just a few years ago. On this next slide, you can see that how that kind of breaks down. So 89% of structured hybrid companies require 2 to 3 days per week in the office. This actually saw a 5% increase in Q3 of 2024. So you can see that in-office aspect starting to creep up. Then on this next slide, you can see 96% of technology companies offer work location flexibility, and that's followed by insurance and financial services rounding out that top three. We might have many of you on the line from those three industries here. And lastly, let's look at how the size of a company might affect company decisions. So larger companies continue to lean more heavily towards structured hybrid policies. So 73% of companies with 25,000 or more employees have a structured hybrid model. And that's in contrast to 70% of small companies, so companies with less than 500 people, that are fully flexible. And now I just pose the question to all of you. Are these stats aligned with your own organization's approach? So feel free to let us know in the chat or share that during our breakouts. So that's kind of the industry. And now let's hear what the workers think. So on this next slide, according to Forbes, here are some workers from a survey taken after Amazon's announcement. So 73% of professionals said they are reconsidering their positions. So Amazon and other companies might be seeing a huge turnover. 77 see RTO policies as a control mechanism rather than a productivity measure. So maybe contrast to what CEO Andy Jassy was saying. And in-office workers spend around just over $1,000 monthly on in-office and commuting expenses, more than double the average hybrid worker. And a lot of these are actually also in line with what the University of Pittsburgh was saying, which is really senior and skilled employees are going to be more likely to leave. In fact, Apple and Microsoft saw senior level employee bases decrease by 5% after some of the return to office policies were there. But this is what else do workers want? This is actually now from PowerToFly's own What Diverse Talent Wants survey. So 60% of respondents wanted more flexible schedule, while 64% wanted more work-life balance. And when actually presented with the option of shorter work weeks, a majority, so 45% of respondents actually would prefer a flexible 40-hour work week. I thought that was very interesting. And half of all respondents said they wouldn't even consider a role that is not at least partially remote. And now let's conclude this portion with a look at some specific underrepresented workers. So according to Indeed, women are 25% more likely to favor remote work than men. This could be because of traditional caregiver roles that still often fall to women and remote work providing that flexibility. Remote.com cites that 17% of disabled workers say their workplace isn't accessible at all. Remote work can open up those accessibility options. And finally, the Williams Institute at UCLA stated that 47% of LGBTQ workers said they face some kind of discrimination or microaggressions in the office. Can remote work, again, work with this? We've actually hosted several events on the benefits that remote work can have on trans workers as specifically. And just going back to conclude here with that University of Pittsburgh survey, that survey reports concerns from some RTO resistant employees that back to office mandates have a disproportionate impact on certain groups like women. So are underrepresented workers facing a bigger hurdle there. All this is to say that difficult decisions await many workers and companies in 2025 as they walk that tightrope between remote, hybrid, and in-person remote options. So I hope that kind of put into context where we are as an industry or different industries. And now I'd love to bring in the head of growth here at PowerToFly, the amazing Sienna Brown. And Sienna, I have some questions for you on some of these topics that we just discussed.
Amazing. Thank you, Robin. Thank you to everyone who's joining us today. I love seeing how much people are getting engaged in the chat. And I'm excited for us to open up conversation before or after I dive into answering some of these questions. Go ahead, Robin.
Awesome. So my first question for you, Sienna, is there is clearly a divide between companies returning to the office while workers are actually craving a greater flexibility. So what advice would you give to leaders if they are struggling with this?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And I mean, even in the data that you were sharing before, there's a clear dissonance between some organizational decisions and what the individual workers are actually wanting in the workplace. And so I'm going to frame this in a couple of ways. Some of us, many of us in this room are leaders. We might not necessarily be able to impact mandate, but I'm going to share best practices for what you can do in your role and the impact that you have. And the first one that I would say is just acknowledging and addressing employees' concerns, right? So if there are changes in your organization that have to do with return to office or maybe even shifting to a hybrid model, really validating employees' feelings about the policy and doing it through a lens of compassion and understanding. So taking time and creating space to really hear about how this might impact individuals in the workplace, and then also creating clear and transparent communication, right? Oftentimes when there is a decision like this being made, it happens over time. So how can you bring individuals into the process so that you also don't see negative impacts when a big decision like this might impact the work, the productivity, and also some of the livelihood of your employees? The other thing that I would just say specifically is, again, in whatever ability you have possible as a leader, thinking about how you can leverage flexibility within those constraints, right? So although fully remote work might not be an option at your organization, what are some ways that you can implement or integrate smaller adjustments, whether that might be flexible start times or remote work on certain days or for certain tasks, or being able to give a little bit more flexibility in work from home days to be able to meet employees halfway. And we'll talk about how we can center inclusivity in mind later on in this conversation. And the last one that I think is really important is going back to the people, right? So in the same way that we are driving towards business outcomes and goals, also thinking about how can we prioritize identifying, gaining data, and putting initiatives towards employees' needs as well. So the people who will drive the business outcomes. And so really working with yourself as a leader and then also with the leaders that you work with around mindsets on how we measure success. Is it time in office? Is it around outcomes? Is it about employee engagement and retention that will lead to the long-term impact that you all want to have? And so I recommend looking at that through a lens of data, especially if you're at the beginning of integrating something like this, and really being able to have either surveys or focus groups to understand how this just doesn't impact in the moment, but will also impact engagement and outcomes over time as well.
Thank you so much. And I think the key word that you mentioned, and I mentioned it earlier in my slides, is flexibility. I think it comes down to often it's remote versus in office, but I think lost in that is the key around flexibility. And I think that's what people are really kind of looking for, as we saw when we surveyed people. It's not about having a shorter work week, it's having flexibility in that week. And you mentioned inclusion and diversity there, so I wanted to kind of dive into that. So what role does flexible work or remote work play in advancing diversity and inclusion goals? And how can companies ensure that when they are perhaps returning to the office or shaping these policies, they don't inadvertently also create inequities?
I love this question, and I'll take it piece by piece. So the first one, when we're thinking about what is the role that it plays, sorry, I think the first thing is simple, right? Expanding your access to top talent across the world, right? So remote work obviously helps eliminate geographical barriers, but it also allows for companies to recruit and retain talent from diverse backgrounds and also underserved regions. So when we're thinking about representation, and Rob, you had shared some really amazing stats. What we saw in our What Diverse Talent Wants survey is that 50% of talent wouldn't even consider a role that's not partially remote. So you're almost limiting some of the opportunities that you have to bring in top talent, no matter where they're located. And I think another integration on how this plays into DEIB goals is creating inclusive environments, right? We saw the data. 25% of women are more likely to favor remote work than men. 17% of disabled workers say their workplace is inaccessible. And when we're thinking about how can we really empower accessibility, whether someone has a disability or they're a caregiver or they have specific unique needs, really being able to try to create and center a culture where everyone can thrive, and realizing that that might take some time to truly understand what are the not just the demographics, but also how do the individuals in your workplace work best, right? And thinking about how can you also use that to create some types of options that enable individuals to do their best work in the limitations that they have. And the last one I just think is mitigating bias, right? Especially mitigating bias in workplace dynamics. Oftentimes when you have hybrid models, you might actually see that remote workers don't have as much access into being seen by individuals within the organization, or their contributions being valued as much, just because of some of the discrepancies. So thinking about how can you also integrate, how to also make you integrate inclusion in some of the practices. And I think, how do we make sure that they don't create inequities? The first one is conduct equity audits, right? So again, regularly assessing the impact of return to office policies to make sure that certain employee groups don't have higher disadvantages and also have the same access and accessibility. And then I would also say, thinking about how are we leading with transparency. I think a lot of the things that we saw in Rob's introduction as well comes with a lack of transparency, a big change that will impact individuals' lives from one day to another, without many organizations thinking about what that is and the impact that that would have within their organization as well.
Yeah, when I was doing my research, Sienna, that transparency aspect were coming up over and over again. You were seeing people say this decision was made without input, or this decision was made suddenly and I don't have the time to really kind of readjust my life, even though sometimes months in advance you have to think some people have moved. So I think that transparency aspect, that feedback aspect you keep going back to, is very key there. And Mary A was saying in the chat, I love this point about transparency. So thank you so much. And my final question for you before we move on to our breakout sessions, where we want to hear from all of you about what's happening in your workplaces, is how do we navigate the return to office versus remote work? And as we navigate the return to office and remote work, what trends or innovations do you foresee shaping the future of workplace dynamics? Because we weren't even having this conversation just a few years ago. So new trends and new things are always emerging. So what do you see as coming next?
No, I love this. And I mean, in the same way where almost 5 years ago now, where does time go? In 2020, a lot of us had to adapt to remote work during the pandemic. There had to be some organizational shifts and also different ways of leading. And I think as we're looking at the return to work versus remote work conversation, something that's really important, especially for all of us in this room, is how are we redefining leadership for that space? So really having a requirement for leaders to develop new skills, understand how they can foster connection in remote, hybrid, or in office. But again, fostering not just connection, but the trust and the accountability across dispersed teams, and really continuing to foster inclusive cultures in this new space. I think a couple of other quick fun ones is obviously technology-driven collaboration. We've been talking a lot about technology and AI specifically this year, and thinking about how advancements in AI and virtual reality might actually be able to help create more immersive and efficient experiences, as well as tools for hybrid teams. So always thinking about, if we host an event in office, how do we make sure that the remote experience is just as inclusive and engaging? And the last two things that I'll just share is sustainability is also a very big trend when it comes to return to office. And so thinking about flexible work processes and how a lot of individuals within organizations have sustainability as a core value, by reducing commuting emissions and advancing DEIB. And so thinking about how is that also tied into the work that you do or the way that you roll out these policies. And the last one, I always go back to people, but wellness as a metric, right? I think over the last year and also with so many different changes within organizations and not just the work that they're doing, but the way that they work, really centering both the mental health and work-life integration of your people need to be a core indicator of the company's success. Because I think oftentimes, again, we're focused on the outcomes without recognizing that employee well-being, engagement, and happiness is also just as important for individuals to reach those organizational goals. Sorry, I got distracted by the shutter. Reach those organizational goals, but not only that, prevent burnout in the way that they're thinking about returning to work, and not just where individuals are working, but how they're working and how they feel about the work that they're doing.
Thank you so much. And I think the sustainability, I hadn't even thought of that, but that's such a great point because I live in New York City. I don't drive, but if certainly people are driving, and even these big office buildings as well, of course, like they need to be heated and air conditioned, whether there's one person in them or 200 or 2,000 people in them. So I hadn't even really thought of that, but I think that makes a lot of sense. So thank you so much, Sienna. This was so great. Hopefully this gave everyone some food for thought as we move into our breakout rooms. And Isa, if you want to add the slides back up, actually, right before we move into our breakouts, one quick other announcement, which is that as we kind of mentioned a bunch during our talks, we are pull a lot of information from our yearly What Diverse Talent Wants survey. So this is our flagship survey, and it really helps us shape what we're doing every year. So if you can also just take a moment to share this link with your teams, I'm going to put it here into the chat. We'd really appreciate if folks on this call could take this, or definitely if you can share it with your teams. It's really going to help us shape what we're doing in 2025. It another moment. Thank you, thank you. I'm seeing everyone pop in. I hope you all had as good of a conversation as we did in my room. It was really fantastic. Just gonna let a few more folks come on in. Thank you. Well, I feel free to add into the chat what some of the things that you were taking away from this conversation were. We had a great conversation in our room that also went into some of the ways that you can enable people in the office as well and what you can do in that regard. So I just love that also. And thank you all so much. So feel free to start adding into the chat, what is one thing that you want to take away from today's conversation? And if you don't add it into the chat, then that's fine. Maybe just as you kind of walk away from today, just think, oh, what's one thing that I want to kind of think about there? And if we want to go to the next slide, we're just going to kind of wrap up with some quick polls. For some reason, my poll questions don't seem to be in. Oh, actually, that's because I'm not the host. So, Isa, if you want to enable the poll, that would be great. And we have a few questions that should be popping up on the screen in a second. And thank you all for adding into the chat, ensuring people understand the why of the decision. That is great. Here we go. There we go. So if you can take a moment to complete this quick poll, this would be great. And first question is, what is your organization's current workplace arrangements, in person or in office, remote, hybrid, or other? Then do you believe that a major change in your working arrangements would affect hiring and or retention? Yes, no, or unsure? And are you planning to, or do you foresee a major change in your working arrangements for 2025, i.e. returning to the office? Yes, no, or unsure? And finally, have you surveyed your team or the company about their work preferences? Yes, no, or unsure. So I'll just let everyone take that for a moment. And if you want to just ping me in the chat, Isa, when most people have completed that, that would be great. Thank you. And just I love some of these other takeaways here. Get more employee feedback, consider accessible in-person workplaces, continue informal fun events. We talked a lot about that as well. And yes, we can work on also sharing some of the slides all with you after this event also. And we're going to be putting together a recap there as well. So you can all take a look and go back to your teams and organizations with some of today's learnings. And whenever you're ready, Isa, if you want to share the survey results. Ah, there we go. So looking at the survey results, hybrid, which very much aligns with the data that we showed at the top of this event. So lots of folks are working hybrid. And then in terms of, do you believe a major change in your work would affect hiring or retention? A resounding 85% said yes. We talked a lot about that in our breakout room as well. Are you planning or do you foresee a major change? So most people said no, but there's some yeses and unsures as well. So of course we'll see what 2025 brings. And have you surveyed the team or company about their work preferences? Majority did say no. So hopefully after today's conversation, that might be an action step that you all want to take to your team. So hopefully this was helpful. We'll share these survey results again, as long with a overarching look at today's event. But all of this is really to say that at the core of any of these solutions is developing and investing in an inclusive company-wide hiring strategy, not just hiring, but also retention and engagement as well. And really, that's to say that the real work, of course, is just beginning. So while these recommendations might not be the be all and end all on today's topic, we hope that we did provide some discussion points that you can take back and actionable steps that you can offer up in 2025. And one more time before I let you all go, we'll be back with our next executive forum in late January. So please reach out if you would like to attend that, or feel free to put a +1 into the chat so we can follow up with you after that. And lastly, I just wanted to wish you all a great holiday season and a very happy new year. And thank you for attending PowerToFly's final event of 2024. So see you back in 2025 at more executive and leadership forums, at our Summit and Job Fair series, at all of our amazing chat and learns that we're hosting every single week. So thank you all. I hope you have a great holiday season and a great new year. And thank you again for all of your insights today. See you in 2025. Bye, everybody.